Hey guys, my name is Dave Foreman. I'm the Director of Coffee for One Line Coffee here in Columbus, Ohio. Today's a very special day. Today's the first day that we're going to be doing a episode of our Brew at Home series. With everything that's been going on in the world, we thought it'd be a good idea to give you guys a little bit of a video tutorial as to how to brew at home and how to make it taste the same as you would pick up here at the shop. So today we're going to start off with our Hario V60. I kind of feel like the Hario V60 is ubiquitous in the coffee industry. Everybody's seen them, everybody knows them. I think it's the one pour over that's probably been around the longest in terms of seeing mass usage. This particular brewer is definitely near and dear to my heart. It is 100% my favorite brewer for a variety of reasons. It is definitely the brewer that I typically use at home. I want to tell you a little bit about why. First thing to think about when we're talking about the Hario V60 is the shape of the brewer. As you can see, it's a cone brewer, conical shape. You'll also notice that there's a very large hole in the bottom. This is one of the things that actually makes the V60 pretty unique. If we compare it to, say, a flat bottom brewer, like a Kalita Wave, obviously has a flat bottom, or something like a Chemex, which you'll notice is also conical, also has a very large hole in the bottom. But they are actually three different brewers. The biggest thing about the flat bottom is that you're going to have some type of support for the grounds in the filter. So because of that, at least on this particular brewer, typically you're going to have a little bit of flow regulation from the holes in the bottom of the brewer. That's going to provide resistance to flow and kind of change the brew dynamics. The V60 doesn't have that. On our Chemex, even though it does have a very large hole in the bottom, the Chemex filters that we typically use on this brewer are significantly thicker, and they're a bonded type of paper. So because of that, the filter itself actually provides a lot of resistance to flow. So again, that's changing the brew dynamics. And that brings us back to the V60. So the V60 actually has a relatively thin paper filter. And because of that, combined with our large hole in the bottom, means that we're pretty much dependent upon the coffee grounds themselves to actually provide resistance to flow. And because of that, we end up with a coffee in the cup that tends to have very high amounts of clarity, tends to be decently balanced, usually pretty bright, and if you brew it right, has a good amount of sweetness. But the important thing is, number one, it's the clarity of flavor. And that brings us back to why this is my favorite brewer. I drink coffee because I like the way it tastes, and I want to explore new coffees. I want to taste a lot of different individual flavor notes in a coffee, and so I always come back to the V60 as kind of my go-to brewer. Now, enough about that, let's talk about brewing a V60 at home. Alright, so let's move on to actually brewing with a V60. There's a few items that you're going to need to brew a V60 at home. Some of them are pretty obvious, some of them might not be so obvious. Number one, you need a V60. They actually sell these in three different sizes. We have a VO1, our little mini guy here, which I absolutely love. This is good for brewing up to about 10 to 12 ounces. We've got our V6002, which is good for brewing up to about 16, maybe 18 ounces total. 16 is probably the limit. And then they do also sell the VO23, which is actually a little more similarly sized to this guy. We have been able to brew up to about 32 ounces in a VO3 pretty successfully. Today we're going to be brewing at the VO2, which I think is the most versatile brewer. It's probably the one that you're going to be able to pick up easiest at your local shop, or from our website if you feel so inclined. The second thing you're going to need, of course, is a filter. So these are the standard Hario filters, direct from Japan. They seem to do the trick. They did change a couple of years ago. The new ones are a little bit slower, a little bit thicker. They still seem to work very, very well. I don't really get any off flavors or paper flavors from these, so we use them. Next thing you're going to need is a scale with a timer. And yes, this is important. One of the issues with V60s is because the grounds are the only thing that's actually providing a resistance to flow, it's very difficult to achieve a consistent extraction unless you are adding the same amount of water at the same time during the brew cycle. And so because of that, you need a scale, you need a timer, and you're actually going to follow a pour schedule, which we're going to get to a little bit later. So scale with a timer, could be the same, could be separate, definitely required. Last thing, not last thing. Next thing is our pour kettle. You need to have a pour kettle that does have a gooseneck spout on it. It doesn't have to be a Hario kettle like this. This is probably the most popular brew kettle in the world. It can be anything. It can be from any manufacturer. But the important thing is that it does have a gooseneck spout. The reason being is that when you're brewing on a V60, you need to be very careful about where that water is going. And again, you want to be able to do it in a very consistent manner. If you try to pour from a large water kettle with a giant spout, you're going to splash water everywhere. You're going to disturb the grounds in a way that you don't want to. So, a kettle, as ridiculous as it may seem, is important. Next thing that we need, of course, is coffee. Find a coffee you love. I've brewed dark roasts, I've brewed medium roasts on a V60. You can certainly do it. I tend to think that light roasts tend to shine, primarily because there is a focus on clarity of flavor. And light roasts tend to have the most complexity of flavor across the board, for the most part. We can talk about that another time. The last thing is something to brew into. Could be as simple as a stainless steel steaming pitcher. Could be your coffee mug. Could be a nice glass carafe. Totally up to you. The last thing I'll say before we actually start brewing is grinder is important. So once again, understanding that since coffee is the only thing that's actually restricting the flow of water, your grind needs to be consistent. A V60 is not a brew method I would use at home if I was reliant on a cheap grinder. You're just never going to be able to get the results out of it that you really want. It's never going to taste as good. You're either going to have coffee that is very under-extracted, very over-extracted, or even if you get your time right, there's a good chance that you'll have coffee that tastes both over-extracted and under-extracted. So for this type of method, I'd recommend at least having something like a Baratza Encore or any of the other Baratza grinders on your counter at home. You can use coffee ground at your local shop as long as they're using a very high quality grinder. It's not going to be quite the same aromatic experience for sure. You're going to lose a little bit of things just to staling, but it is possible, and I have done it at home when my grinder has been broken. Alright, so let's get brewing. First thing we're going to do is put our filter into our V60. The easiest way to do that is to take the filter, you're going to fold it over right at the seam and give it a really nice sharp crease. Once you've done that, you're going to open it up. You're going to put the two seams right against each other and you're going to kind of flatten it out. That's going to help the filter sit nice and flush in the V60. Second thing I'm going to do, grab a little water. I'm going to add the water to the empty V60 with the filter in it. This accomplishes a couple of things. Number one, it's going to pre-wet the filter. It's going to rinse out some of the paper flavor that we might get from the filter. It's also going to make sure that the filter is nice and saturated, which is really important. If the filter is not saturated, sometimes you can have issues with channeling. Water likes to go where water already is. And so if you end up with sections of the filter that are dry when you start, sometimes water doesn't end up making its way to that part of the filter, and because of that, also to the coffee that's next to that part of the filter. So having the filter nice and wet is a great idea. Second thing it does is it also preheats your brewing vessel. I'm going to go ahead and dump this out. And I'm going to add my coffee. Alright, so the next step is I'm going to go ahead and shake my V60 gently to level the bed of grounds. Just want to make sure it's relatively level. Don't need to do it too forcefully. Now, just before I brew, I do want to talk for a second about water. There's a couple of things about water that we need to be concerned about. Number one is what's in it, because that's going to affect how it actually brews the coffee, what it can extract, how quickly it can extract, how well it can extract. And the second is going to be temperature. For the most part, if you're on a municipal system, it's probably not going to produce terrible coffee, but there is a wide variety of hardness levels and alkalinity levels that you're going to see across different municipal systems. Here in Columbus, we're pretty lucky. For the most part, our water is actually pretty good. Really just need a carbon and sediment filter to pull out some of the chlorine in order to make it taste good. There are some options out there if you're not sure what your water looks like. Something like distilled water with some mineral addition packets from Third Wave Water can do very, very well. So that's something to think about. In terms of temperature, a lot of times people will tell you don't use boiling water, and for the most part that's true. People will throw out numbers in terms of what's actually best for brewing, but in my opinion, the idea is to get as hot as you can without it actually being boiling. Ideally at home, if I'm heating my water in an electric kettle, I'm probably shooting for 208, 209. If I'm heating my water on a stove top, I'm going to let it come to boil, and then I'm going to immediately rinse my filter and then immediately start brewing. So it's probably had a chance to drop maybe 2 to 3 degrees by the time I'm actually starting with it. The temperature of the water does affect the ability of water to be a solvent. So I think more than anything else, as you're adjusting other variables to kind of adjust the flavors that you're finding in your brew, you just need to be consistent. So if you're going to wait 15 seconds off boil to brew every time, just do that. Every time, 15 seconds off a brew. That allows you to achieve consistency and be able to alter other variables in your brew to try to get the flavors that you want. So that all being said, I have a lovely commercial water tower over here that's going to give me the exact temperature of water I need, so I'm going to grab some right now. Alright, so I'm actually going to do 2 brews for you guys. The first one you're going to watch me hands on. I'm going to talk a little bit about what I'm doing. The second one I'm going to let you guys get a little in close and kind of see exactly where the water's going and exactly what I'm doing so that you can mimic those actions at home. When we start, really there's going to be, you're going to notice there's 6 pours. I'm going to have my initial bloom, which is basically just enough water to actually wet the coffee, or wet the grounds fully and make sure they're fully saturated. Usually that's going to be about 1.5 to 2 times the weight of the grounds in water. Today I'm brewing about 340 milliliters of water. I'm using about 24 grams of coffee. So I'm going to use about 40 to 48 grams of water initially. Past that point, I'm actually going to use a pour schedule, which means that in certain minute and second increments, I'm actually going to add water, and I'm going to do it consistently. The reason I'm going to do this is, again, by using a consistent pour schedule, I can figure out how long it's taking my brew to finally drop out at the end, and then I can make adjustments to my grind or adjustments to my dose to get the flavors that I want. If I change the way that I pour, or if I change my pour schedule, that can have an effect on the brew, which means that then I don't know what actually changed those flavors. Was it because I adjusted my brew schedule, or was it because maybe I made my grind a little bit finer? So by keeping things, again, consistent, it allows you to really dial in a great pour. So, I'm going to go ahead and do my initial pour, my initial bloom. Started my clock, and I'm adding about, like I said, 45, 48 grams of water. I'm not as concerned with how much water I'm adding here, as long as I know everything's nice and saturated. Once that water's in here, I'm actually going to stir real well. What I'm really doing here is just making sure that all of my grounds are wet. I just want to make sure there's no dry pockets in there. This allows me to get a brew that is going to be very consistent and uniform. So at 30 seconds, I'm going to go ahead and start my first pour. I'm using a pour schedule that I've been using for a very long time. At 30 seconds, I'm going to add enough water to get my total weight up to 135 grams. So this is kind of my initial pour. After this, I'm adding about 55 grams of water every 15 seconds, starting again at 55 seconds in. So at 55, I'm doing another pour. I'm going to take my total up to 190 grams. Wait just a few seconds. At 110, I'm adding enough to get to 245. Now you'll be able to see this later, but I'm pouring not on the sides of the filter, but I'm making sure that I'm actually staying on the coffee. At 125, I'm adding enough water to get up to 300 grams. And finally, at 1:40, I'm going to do my final addition and get my total weight up to 340 grams of water. If you go a few grams under, a few grams over, not a huge issue, but again, you want to be consistent. So after I've done that last pour, I'm actually going to get my spoon back in there. I'm actually going to kind of dig down and try to lift all of the grounds off from the bottom of that cone. And then I'm going to give it a good stir. The reason I do that is I want to make sure that all the grounds are well saturated, that they're well surrounded by water, Again, this does two things. That stir increases the uniformity of the extraction if you're doing it consistently. And it's also actually increasing the extraction yield because it's adding agitation. There's been a lot of debate whether you should stir or whether you shouldn't stir. After many years, I have come to the conclusion that stirring is a good thing as long as you are consistent in the way that you do it. Now, in terms of total brew time, that brew time is actually going to be a feedback for me in terms of my grind setting. I'm aiming with this particular paper filter for something between 3 minutes and 3:15. If my total brew time or total extraction time is less than 3 minutes, that probably means that I ground my coffee a little too coarse. If it's longer than 3:15, that means I probably ground my coffee a little too fine. So this dropped out at 3:07, which is just about perfect time. I'm sure that this coffee will be quite delicious. Alright, so now we get to drink. This coffee that I'm brewing today is actually a very, very new release for us. It's from a farm in El Salvador called La Honderita de Jose. This is their second year purchasing from the farm. Last year we purchased their fully washed Pacamara Pacas offering. It was amazing, probably one of my favorite coffees of the entire year. This year they actually had a full natural offering, which I was pretty excited for, and I am smitten. It's delicious. We just started offering it on the website, so feel free to keep an eye out for it. Flavor notes are really, really delicious. Lavender, cotton candy, vanilla, guava. Well, it's good coffee. Alright guys, so I'm actually going to brew one more cup. We're going to move the camera angle around so you can kind of see a little bit more into the brewer. You can see what I'm actually doing, where the water's being poured, how the stirring is being done. We'll also post the brew schedule that I used today up here, or maybe here, as we do it, so you guys can follow along. Alright, so first step, we're going to pre-wet the filter. Notice I am using a pretty generous amount of water here. Helps preheat everything and get that filter nice and rinsed. I'm going to go ahead and add my coffee. Give it a nice shake, nice and level. Turn on my scale, let it get to 0. I'm going to talk through this pour schedule one more time. I'm going to go ahead and start my timer, start my pours. As you can see, I'm pouring the water only on the coffee, just enough to get everything fully saturated. And as you can see, really what I'm doing here is just trying to make sure there's no dry pockets. Not really any brewing going on right now because there's no flow per se. At 30 seconds, I'm going to start my first major pour. Again, you can see that I'm pouring only on the coffee. I'm bringing my initial weight up to 135 grams. At 55 seconds, go ahead and do another pour. Bring my total weight up to 190 grams. At a minute 10, up to 240, or 245. Now 125 up to 300. Again, notice where the water's going. And finally at a minute 40, I'm going to bring it up to 340 grams. Now one of the reasons you do need a gooseneck kettle is you want to be gentle with your pours. This again allows you to be consistent with your pour technique. You're going to be able to create a consistent cup every time you brew. And again, you saw me lift the grounds up from the bottom and give it a good stir. If you do it right, you should have kind of a mound of coffee in the center when the water drains all the way out. So this is a new coffee that we're brewing. Again, I'm aiming for 3 minutes to 3:15. For those who are keeping track at home, that dripped out in 2 minutes and 37 seconds, which is a little fast. So what does this tell me? It tells me my grind was just a little bit too coarse. What I need to do is actually fine the grind a little bit. Fining the grind is going to kind of decrease the space that's between those ground particles, because with finer grinds we can pack them together a little bit better. That's going to slow down my flow rate, and it's going to extend my brew time out till I get to that 3 to 3:15 mark. Well guys, thank you so much for joining me today. Again, this is our first in our brew series. Give us some feedback, let us know what you think. Again, this is Dave Foreman from One Line Coffee. Keep an eye out, our next brew video should be coming out. We're going to do something that probably 95% of you have at home, which is a French press. French presses may seem easy, but there's maybe a few tricks up our sleeves that'll help you brew a better cup. So make sure you tune in, and look forward to seeing you all next time.